Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Our DEI spotlight this month is Native Americans. November is National Native American Heritage Month. And today I have the very distinct pleasure of featuring Annita Lucchesi, the founder of the Sovereign Bodies Institute. Sovereign Bodies Institute, or SBI, builds on indigenous traditions of data gathering and knowledge transfer to create, disseminate, and put into action research on gender and sexual violence against indigenous people. Anita will provide a wealth of information on several topics, including information about murdered and missing indigenous people. If you were able to join us for June for Pride Month when we were talking with Cy Burnaby, you may recall that the Stonewall riots of 1970 started as a result of police brutality. Then the next month in July, Kenjan took police brutality head on in connection with the National Minority Mental Health Month, as police brutality not only abuses our physical bodies, but also our mental health as well. And then in October, for National Latinx Heritage Month, we had a discussion of how police are failing to protect undocumented workers from abuse, as well as employers who are exploiting them. So I am no longer surprised by the continuous discovery of abuse and neglect by police in several ways. And unfortunately, this month is no different. For today's topic, Native Americans, and particularly women and girls, are being murdered and have gone missing, and police are not investigating these crimes. Approximately 4,200 missing and murdered cases have gone unsolved, and it could be more by today. Well, we'll hear more from Anita. It is another instance, although, of not mattering, being invisible, and a host of other aggressions that communicate which communities in America matter and which do not. If this is your first time joining us, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Kennedy Cobbin Richardson, and I am a partner at Kenjan LLC. We are a consulting firm specializing in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We bring an innovative and holistic approach to developing people, teams, and culture. We are laser focused on actual behavioral change by building a groundswell of DEI champions that are influential at every level of the organization. Our training is evidence based as well as data driven to help people, one, acquire the essential skills to have courageous conversations. If you can't talk about it, you can't solve it. Secondly, acknowledge and accept the history and context of injustice in America. If you don't admit to what has actually happened, then there's no real ability for remedy. Thirdly, articulate the lived experiences of marginalized groups. Many times, we marginalized people are not in the room, and so, therefore, if you are privileged enough to be in the room, then the voices still need to be represented. And that would be on you if you are acting as an ally, which is the fourth level of acting as an ally to accelerate DEI wherever you live, work, and play. So, this is on the job, at the gym, at your kids' school, and all the other places where injustices can happen, and you can be an ally to stop it. Now, a little bit more about me. I am a certified DEI consultant. I've spent 20 years in the industry, and I work with multinational corporations and nonprofits. In addition to DEI, I have expertise in workforce development, youth development, nonprofit leadership, and design thinking and innovation. I'm a former teacher, executive director of 3 nonprofits, and a writer for television. My passion really is removing barriers to help people actualize their full potential. And so, in the design thinking culture, we ask ourselves, how might we, how might I, and how might I help the workplace remove arbitrary barriers, which means those that we cannot control. I cannot control that I was born a woman, born Black, or the age that I am today. I can't stop time. And so, how can I remove arbitrary barriers for a workplace's employees and candidates who want to work there so that we can all achieve the American dream? And that essentially is what drives me every day. And so, about allyship, just to be clear on what being an ally is, it's a person of one social identity group who provides actionable support to members of another group. And so it's not advocacy, but actually action. in order to be an ally, and typically a member of the dominant group forming an alliance with a marginalized individual or group that is a victim of bias, is being discriminated against, or treated unjustly. And so, for our topic today and celebration of Native Americans, there are about 5.2 million American Indians and Alaska Natives in the United States. Native Americans are the most impoverished of all ethnic communities. An NPR poll revealed that 54% of Native Americans living in tribal communities say they have been discriminated against when applying for jobs. Additionally, a recent report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics displays that Native Americans are getting left behind in the remote work economy. And so I am excited really to talk about how we can be better at supporting and advocating and being an ally to the Native American community, because yesterday's injustice is today's inequality. So what happened yesterday affects us today, and it shows up as inequality among genders, races, religions, and all sorts of other arbitrary barriers that hold us back. And so when you ask yourself, why would I listen to this? And that is that if you want to be an ally and if you're interested in your company having the DEI mindset, which means that they are aware of injustices faced by marginalized groups. And the only place and the most reliable place to get your information is from someone from the group themselves, and particularly people that we have on our podcast, the ability for people to get the word out who are, I guess we could say, thought leadership. They are the thought leaders of these issues, and this is the best place to capture this information. So in order to become an ally, you first have to be educated, and then secondly, you have to have the conviction to remedy the wrongs of the past. So you can't just know about it and it'd be great dinner conversation, but what can you do in order to move issues forward and remove the barriers that are affecting marginalized groups? And so, again, I am pleased to welcome to our broadcast Annita Lucchesi as the founder and director of research and outreach at Sovereign Bodies Institute. She is a Cheyenne descent. She is of Cheyenne descent and currently lives on her Cheyenne homelands in Montana. She is a survivor of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and trafficking. And outside of her role at SBI, Annita is pursuing a PhD at the University of Arizona School of Geography, Development, and Environment, and is a graduate scholar at UA's Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance. Please welcome Annita Lucchesi. Hi, Annita.
Hi there. Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for having me here.
You are welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I really had a great conversation with you in preparation for this podcast, and I'm excited for more people to get to know the information that you shared with me. Do you want to take over, share your PowerPoint?
Sure. Let's see. Do I just click on it? There we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Annita. As Kennedy shared, I'm here to talk about the work we do at Sovereign Bodies Institute, and in particular on gender and sexual violence against Indigenous people. We also work quite extensively on missing persons and murder cases. And I'm pleased to hear that this podcast has already had a really robust dialogue on police violence. It is something that we address in our work pretty much on a daily basis as well, which I'll touch on further in this presentation. So just, briefly to introduce myself, you heard a little bit about me just now. My name in my tribal language is Hitov, which means evening star woman. And I do live here on my homelands in Southeast Montana, about 2 hours from Billings. I know that usually presentations like this start with a land acknowledgement. That's the land acknowledgement you'll get from me. I'm here at home, like ultimate home. You can see I'm in my kitchen, but I'm also on my ancestral homelands. I think giving a land acknowledgement is, more than just saying whose land you're on, but also the relationship to the land that you're on, your relationship to that land, and also to to the traditional caretakers of that land. So for me, I did not grow up on my homelands. I grew up in Northern California, and was living kind of a triangle life between California, Arizona, where I'm going to school, and Montana, where my tribe and my culture and my homelands are. And in the midst of the pandemic, decided it's time for me to come home. And so I was really fortunate to be able to purchase a home about 20 miles off of our reservation, in the nearest border town, which is still part of our homelands. Our reservation makes up a very small portion of our homelands. Um, and it's been a really transformative experience for me to learn what it means to be a Cheyenne woman taking care of Cheyenne land, and to put that land, which was previously owned by a white family, back into Cheyenne ownership. So that's been a really powerful journey for me, where I'm taking language classes at our tribal college, took plant medicine and botany. It's been a really deep engagement with the land. So I would encourage all of you, as you move forward, no matter what kind of dialogue you're having, if you're the type that wants to do a land acknowledgement, take the extra 2 minutes, to give more of that personal information about your knowledge and connection to the land and the people who are, indigenous to it. I think that'll push us, I really like what Kennedy shared about allyship being, actionable, or being in action. And I think, a land acknowledgement that's a little more personal in that way pushes us towards actionable relationships. So yeah, that's how I introduce
Before you
myself.
go on, I just also want to say that we talked about sometimes land acknowledgements appear somewhat performative,
Mhm.
and that another way to also have a connection with the people and the land that you're occupying is financial contributions, based on the fact that um, there is so much poverty and lack of basic resources, that a contribution can go a long way, and that if you can include in your land acknowledgement that your company is also a donor to
Mhm.
indigenous people of the land that you're occupying, that would be, have a little bit more action behind that as well. So I'd like to encourage people to do that. That the next time you do a land acknowledgement, also acknowledge the fact that you're a donor and a contributor, and someone who is helping that land.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation. Tribal governments can receive donations, but also there's oftentimes nonprofit organizations like land trusts, language conservancies, even things like we don't have a domestic violence shelter where I live, or our reservation, even my house 20 miles off of it, doesn't have clean drinking water. So there's very real material needs, whether it comes to like our physical survival, like, water or a safe shelter, but also our cultural survival, like a land trust or a language program. So lots of opportunities to support. And that definitely is something that's a lot more meaningful than just kind of saying, we acknowledge we're on so-and-so's land and then moving on. So I will move forward with our presentation. Today, I'm going to talk about our organization, Sovereign Bodies Institute. I'm going to give an overview of our research philosophy, and in particular, highlight how Indigenous data sovereignty is a core tenet of our work. I'm going to share about SBI's Circle of Care for Families and Survivors. And when I reference families, I mean families of missing and murdered Indigenous people, which in this presentation is shortened to MMIP. You'll also hear MMIW sometimes. That just stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. There's lots of different versions of that acronym. Some people tack on G for girls, some people tack on 2 for Two-Spirit. We use the letter P to include people of all genders and ages. So in particular, in talking about our care for families and survivors, I'm going to talk about our All Our Relations Service program, and then our research and outreach program, and the kinds of cases we work on, some of the more predominant needs that we're seeing among the families and survivors we serve. And then I want to close out with discussion of how folks can support not just us as an organization, but this movement and this issue in general. So SBI is a nonprofit research center focused on gender and sexual violence against Indigenous peoples. One thing that I'm very proud of is that we are survivor and MMIP family led. So what that means is our board, our staff, our community partners, the vast majority of them are Indigenous survivors of violence and or a family member of someone who's missing or murdered. So it's personal to all of us in our own ways. As was mentioned earlier, I'm a survivor of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and trafficking. I'm also a survivor of police violence and have missing and murdered loved ones in my family and my greater kind of social circle. So definitely personal to me. We started out as the home of the MMIW database, and we've since changed it to MMIP to include all genders. Really, so I escaped trafficking about 8 years ago, and I was working on my master's degree. And my academic work looks at Indigenous cartographic practices and how we could use those to come to terms with the violence that we've experienced and imagine new geographies of safety. So MMIP was one of the issues on one of the maps, but it wasn't necessarily the focus of my work. But I needed a good working number of how many cases were out there. And there was lots of numbers out there and lots of lists out there, but none of them matched and none of them were being continuously updated. So I was pretty naive in thinking I could start that project and it would have a start and an end. 8 years later, it's become my life's work, at least for now. And we've documented almost 5,000 cases so far across the US and Canada. In 2019, we did expand the database, and I'll talk about that later in this presentation. When we first launched SBI in late 2018, the idea was that it would be a more formal home for that database that I had been caring for just as a community member. I wasn't paid for it. It wasn't tied to anything. It was just a labor of love. My little sister was our first official intern. It was as grassroots as it gets. But it was starting to get used by community members in all these really exciting ways. And press was starting to take interest in it. We felt that it needed a more formal home where it could be protected and cared for, knowing that it represents stories of thousands of families and really the worst thing that they've ever been through. And for that reason was really sensitive, sacred data that needed to be treated with a lot of care and needed to be owned and governed by the community, not by an individual. So that's how SBI came to be. And the idea was that it would be a home for the database, but also all these other exciting research projects that were growing out of it, with the understanding that there's never been a research hub where we as Indigenous people, and in particular MMIP family members and survivors of violence, there's never been a place where we got to be the experts on the violence that we experienced. Even though we know this issue better than anyone because we've lived it, and because we're also the grassroots people doing the boots on the ground work, helping other families and survivors and leading missing person searches and advocating for families in the court system. As Indigenous people, we're really on our own. The system is very abusive to us, and there's we really don't get help. So when it's time for something to get done, like helping look for a missing person or hold a vigil for a murdered person, we're on our own. Victim services often doesn't even pick up the phone.
Oh, wow.
That's the spirit of this movement, and the spirit of SBI was that we could be a home for our own expertise, our own leadership, and telling our own stories and using those stories to create data-driven change in our communities in a way that felt good to us as families and survivors, but also from a culturally relevant perspective. So this is our research philosophy. These are kind of our 5 core tenets as an organization. First, research is an ancestral practice. White people did not invent research. Our ancestors have always been researchers because fundamentally, research is a process of gathering information and piecing it together as a way to make sense of the world around you. We've always done that. Second, families and survivors are the experts. We know this issue better than anyone because we've lived it. And as was mentioned, we're oftentimes the grassroots leaders leading the work in the first place. Third, efforts to end violence against Indigenous peoples must be rooted in tribal sovereignty and Indigenous self-determination. So Native people have a kind of different experience than other marginalized communities or other races. I'm sorry, my puppy just jumped up on the table. Get down. And because it's not just a racial category, it's a political identity. We're living under ongoing colonial occupation. And for those of us that are enrolled tribal members, we're citizens of sovereign nations, or in my case, a descendant of a sovereign nation. And because of that, we have a different legal relationship with the US government. We have different standing when it comes to, for us being sovereign nations and being able to exercise our self-determination, which can include our own governance systems, our own justice systems, our own land management systems, our own education systems. We have a legal right to all of those things, and they're under attack constantly. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Burkine versus Holland, which is currently being debated in the Supreme Court, but it's an attack on the Indian Child Welfare Act, which gives us the right to keep our foster kids within our tribal communities and not being adopted out to non-Native people. It's currently being attacked by a law firm that specializes in really predatory oil and gas leases. What we mean when we say that trying to end this violence has to be rooted in that sense of sovereignty and self-determination, I think the easiest way to explain it is like, if you make soup that's too salty, you're not going to fix it by adding a bunch more salt in. And so if the root cause of violence against Indigenous people is colonialism, we're not going to fix it by pouring a bunch more colonialism in. So that means that the solutions are not going to come from the federal government. The solutions are going to come from tribal nations and Indigenous people, and be rooted in that right for us to govern ourselves. Fourth, good research is research that heals, empowers, or mobilizes. Our people are dying every day. I know because I'm the one planning the funerals and looking for the bodies and reviewing the autopsies. We don't have time for anything that doesn't heal, empower, or mobilize. We just don't. And last, our research is stronger when our people are strong and their needs are met. We learned that really early on in the process, which is why we grew to also be a service provider. We found really quickly that the families and survivors we were working with to document their stories and try to translate that into some actionable research, they had very basic material needs that were not being met that prevented them from really having their voices heard or even taking the time to share their stories with us. And so that's why we created our services program, which I will share more about later in the presentation. I want to give an example of why Indigenous data sovereignty matters in addressing issues like this. And for those of you that don't know what Indigenous data sovereignty is, the basic idea of it is that Indigenous people have a right to govern data about ourselves, our cultures, our homelands, the violence we experience, anything having to do with us. We should have the ultimate governing power in how that data is gathered, what data is gathered, where it's stored, who does what with it, all of that. And so the example that I wanted to share, these are memes that came out in the last 2 weeks that were circulating through Native Facebook. The example I wanted to share of why Indigenous data sovereignty matters is because is looking at racial classification in law enforcement and government data. So these two memes are joking about, I don't know if anybody remembers this time last year for Native American Heritage Month, Native people were referred to as, quote, something else on national news as in terms of our racial category. So they had all the other races listed in percentages, and then it was just something else. So we kind of turned it into a joke of like, oh, we're something else. And then this year, I think it was ABC News, there was somebody who, I'm sure they meant to say Indigenous creatives because they were talking about media created by Indigenous people, but they said Indigenous creatures. And we turned that into a joke too. And that's what these memes are referencing. Last year we were something else. This year we're Indigenous creatures. Who knows what will be next year. But this is the way that the Native community jokes about, like, it's really offensive to be called a creature on national television. But all we can do is laugh about it. So the meme on the right is, like, what are you? NDN is like short for Indian. Aboriginal and First Nations are what they use in Canada. Something else, and Indigenous creatures are on the news. And, this person's like crying, like, I don't even know what I am no more. Because, these terms get confusing for somebody who doesn't know what the proper terminology is, or especially if you don't know a lot of Native people, you might say something embarrassing like we're Indigenous creatures or something else. So unfortunately, that kind of like system ignorance and bias, it's not individual, it is systematic, and it does translate into the data. So when we look at data on missing and murdered Indigenous people, for example, if we were to file a Freedom of Information Act request asking in a particular jurisdiction how many incidents of murdered Native Americans do they have, it's going to vary based on who the coroner decided was Native American, right? So for John and Jane Does, that could be like left wildly to interpretation. But even people that are identified, for example, my auntie, who's from our tribe here in Montana, but she was killed in San Diego, California. The coroner listed her race as Cheyenne, not Northern Cheyenne, which is the name of our tribe, not American Indian, not Native American, just Cheyenne, which, it wasn't malicious. It's because they genuinely don't know. But if we were to file a records request asking for how many murder cases happened in that area, her case wouldn't be included in the final count because she was listed under the wrong term. So getting it right when it comes to these terms matters. Listening to Native people on how we identify ourselves matters. It has drastic consequences on how we understand the scope and severity of violence and crime, how we might start addressing those issues and trying to build violence prevention. If our number is way off because people are racially misclassified, then we're not going to be working with the right data, and we're probably not going to produce an effective solution. Another example of racial misclassification that I've seen a lot is we got back from an entire state a data set. It was from the state of Washington, a data set on missing Native women and girls for the last 10 years. And they did give us every incident by name, which was awesome. But we had to, when we started cleaning the data, we had to make a whole nother tab called Wrong Kind of Indian, because they had people with like the last name Singh listed as American Indian instead of Indian American. There was over 130 incidents of that. So that's not just one individual officer, that's an entire agency really confused. So, again, these terms matter. And I can't speak for every Native or Indigenous person in terms of, what the best term is to use. I'll say in general, Native American is, I think, the most commonly accepted, or just Native. But Indigenous has more of a global connotation to it. inclusive of Indigenous peoples outside the US, whereas Native American or American Indian references people within the US, as well as, Alaska Native is, of course, specific to Alaska. And the reason they separate Alaska Native from American Indian is, again, a legal issue. So we're called American Indians because we live in a legal area called Indian country, and we're subject to Indian law. Alaska Natives are not under that umbrella because Alaska is not considered Indian country, so they aren't considered Indians. It has nothing to do with like we're all Indigenous, we're all Native. It's strictly, a legal category and definition that separates out Alaska Natives. They have a corporation system, which is different from the tribal nation system we have in the lower 48. The kind of different legal systems we live under within the federal government. And the same goes for like Native Hawaiians. They're Native too. But they also, they're not considered American Indians because they're not subject to Indian law. So the long story short, those are all colonial terms. And I think Native is the most widely accepted one. But it also depends on context. If you're talking about a legal issue, American Indian might make more sense. So I think the easiest way to know which term to use is to get to know Native people, get to know Native issues, and kind of suss out for yourself what makes the most sense based on context. In general, it's always better to refer to someone by their tribe rather than, as Native or as Indigenous. Like myself personally, yes, I'm Indigenous. Underneath that is, Native American. And underneath that, as like my first priority is being Northern Cheyenne. So that's one way to think of it. But again, it depends on context, because if we were to look at my auntie's coroner's report listing her race as Cheyenne, really doesn't make sense. Cheyenne is an ethnic category, not a racial category, and really a political identity as a citizen of a sovereign nation, and makes pulling crime data very difficult, which I think is why it's so important that Native people are able to govern data about ourselves, because we know how to organize it and catalog it and clean it in a way that makes sense to us. So I want to touch on the services program that we have, which is called All Our Relations. The idea behind it is that, we're here to serve families and survivors, no matter where they are in the process of trying to seek justice or get healing. Right now, we have about 500 families and survivors we serve across the US and Canada. The majority of them are here in the US, but we do offer services to families and survivors anywhere in the Americas. And our advocates speak English and Spanish. The needs of families vary greatly from one to the next. But one thing that I'm proud of for our services program is that we work from the perspective that there's no expiration date on trauma. So whether your loved one went missing 30 years ago or yesterday, we're here for you in every step of the process, and you're eligible for the same exact resources. Sometimes that includes case advocacy, which I'll talk about more. I'm our kind of systems advocate for families and survivors, but it also includes basic needs. So this is a very abbreviated list of the kinds of things we offer. Basic needs, including housing, food, and clothing. I think food and clothing are definitely our most common needs. Also during the winter months, emergency shelter. Last winter, the state of Montana, every shelter was full for over 6 months, and they were turning away Native people on the basis that our clients wouldn't be able to get jobs in the cities where the shelters are, and so wouldn't be able to ever make enough money to get out of the shelter. So it didn't make sense for the shelter to take them in the first place. We had a lot of people turned away for that reason. Last winter, I think we maxed out at almost 50 families living out of motel rooms, because it gets down to -40 here, and there's just nowhere for people to go. Yeah, and we've taken it up with policymakers here in Billings and Yellowstone County. I took it up with the mayor's office and public health, the director of public health for the county, basically, and emergency services. So this is totally within their realm. Basically, said word for word, if natives don't want to freeze to death in Billings, they need to go back to the res where they belong. That's the kind of racism we deal with when we leave our communities. The cities are very unsafe, hostile environments. I work with the homeless population quite a bit, and there's really common stories about homeless natives being picked up by non-native men in vans and beaten severely and then dumped back on the sidewalk. It's common. I've also seen police get involved in that kind of violence. Billings has the second highest rate of police brutality in the country, and over a third of their victims that they've killed are Native, even though we're only 6% of the city's population. They also have a reputation for being involved in sex trafficking of Native people in the city. And that's not just, Billings. When I was trafficked in Spokane, I was solicited by Spokane police officers, and Department of Corrections officers knew what was going on, and allowed it and encouraged it. So that is something we see quite a bit. So yeah, that housing, safe shelter is a big issue. That is a big cost for us. Also, you can see emergency relocation, trying to get away from an abuser. We help with utilities, cell phone, healing services, treatment, help getting to ceremony, medical needs, transport. We are building a missing person search team for the city of Billings and assist missing person search efforts elsewhere as well. We help with funerals and burials, vigils and awarenesses. And it's not just money that we're providing. It's also like around this time last year, we had a 15-year-old boy from my community that was murdered. He was selling drugs to try to feed his younger siblings. And we didn't just pay for the wake. And like in our culture, you make a new pair of moccasins to when you bury someone, they wear those. It's a special kind that they wear in the place where they go after they pass on. We're also like we're buying the food for the wake. We're helping cook it. We're buying the items for the moccasins and help beating and sewing them up. We're there for every step of the process. And in that particular case, when we came over to drop off food for the wake, it was clear that his younger siblings hadn't eaten in probably a week. The only clothes they had were dirty. They had bugs. They were living in a trap house. And like they were severely neglected. Hadn't been in school in over a year. And so there's the immediate of like trying to coordinate a funeral and a wake, but also helping those kids in the long term. And we were able to successfully get them in the custody of their father instead of the person they were with at the time, so that they were in a healthy living environment, purchased clothes for them, got them cleaned up, got treatment for the bugs, made sure that they got adequate food and that they have the things they need to go to school. But that's the kind of wraparound support we offer. It's never just a one and done. And usually those basic needs last long after the initial incident of violence. Even when a family does qualify for victim services, which can be rare, there's still victim services. There's only so much they can cover, and it's usually a limited timeline. For us, we know that timeline really doesn't make sense, especially in murder cases where the victim was a parent, because typically the grandparent ends up taking custody of those children. And that can be, that's a lifetime commitment that they didn't plan for. But even just in the shorter term, feeding and clothing young kids and having childcare and getting them into school and, all of the things that, you need to do for young kids. oftentimes these are, elders who don't have the financial or logistical means to provide that level of care, but are trying desperately to keep their grandkids out of the system. So we actually have, I'm proud that as an organization, we're probably one of the very few that has a line item in our budget for grandmas, because we have so many grandmas that have been our clients for 4 years, because, they need long-term help, keeping their grandkids out of the system and making sure their needs are met because of the violence that happened years ago. And that's okay. That's what we're there for. And that's the kind of system of care that I think, when you have families and survivors leading the work, this is the kind of thing that we build, things that would benefit us. We know what people need because it's our needs too. Our research and outreach program, first I want to talk about our case advocacy because that kind of builds on our services program. I'm our case advocate. So what I mean by that is I don't work in our services program anymore, although I used to. Now my primary job in working with families and survivors is helping them navigate the justice and legal systems. So that can include being a liaison to police and the investigating agency, attending and reviewing autopsies and medical exams, coordinating vigils and memorials, trying to coordinate with the press on, raising coverage on the case, and also working with prosecutors' offices and court staff, mainly to make sure that families know their rights and survivors know their rights throughout these processes and understand how the system works or usually doesn't work, to address the violence that they or their loved one has experienced, and to really advocate for the system to do the bare minimum of their job, which I would say 99% of the time does not happen. Out of the approximately 500 families that access our services program, I would say at least 300 of them are also accessing this kind of case advocacy. And that's a big part of my day-to-day work. It's difficult, but it is rewarding when you have success. For example, there's a lot of system bias in how medical examiners and coroners review remains of deceased Indigenous people. We had a case of a woman from my tribe who was, her medical exam, basically they decided that her death was accidental, and they said it's because she was a drunk, just another drunk Indian, which is one of the biggest stereotypes about us, and said, yeah, she was covered in bruises, but it's because she kept falling down drunk. And when I was able to review the medical exam and actually review all of the photos of her remains, and the documentation of her injuries with the medical examiner, I saw that the bruises were circular and quarter shaped, which doesn't make sense for somebody falling down drunk. And I asked, could those come from being kicked by steel-toed cowboy boots? And the medical examiner said, yeah, that actually makes way more sense. Police never told the medical examiner that the victim had an abusive boyfriend that wore steel-toed cowboy boots for 20 years. So that case still hasn't been brought to justice, but we did get it reopened. And now they're in the process of deciding if they can change it from accidental to undetermined, so that at least there's potential room for justice. So that kind of advocacy, like I said, it's challenging. I've seen my niece's classmates on the autopsy table. And there's really nothing. I've been through pretty much every trauma you can think of. There is nothing more traumatizing than seeing your niece's classmate dead on a table and observing the rape exam on their remains. But it makes a difference, not just for that family and for that case, but also that we're able to catch system failures and gaps in the system so that hopefully it doesn't happen to the next family. That is one part of our R&O program. Our other stuff includes all the things you see here on this slide, building partnerships, media and public awareness, policy work. We still maintain the database daily. We have our own internal projects. Next year, we're embarking on a project on police brutality and another one on missing and runaway Native youth. We also take on partnerships with tribal nations and Indigenous-led organizations. And we have a program called Leading Community Researchers, which supports Indigenous community members who have an idea to address this violence in their community, but lack institutional support. And we provide that support and kind of coach them through the process. And the idea is that they create a deliverable that's relevant to other Indigenous communities elsewhere as well. So we have two of those that are coming out in the next couple months. One of them coming out this month. That one's on pottery as a form of Indigenous data visualization, looking at Jane Does in our database. And then the one coming out after that is on creating healing centers for Indigenous women that have been forcibly sterilized, which has been a major issue in Canada, the US, and Peru. Yeah, I realize like our work is so varied. I could talk for hours and I realize I'm running short on time, but hopefully this gives you a snapshot of the diversity of the work that we do and how many entry points there are to get involved. So in terms of supporting us, follow us on social media, share out our work. We are a nonprofit, so we do accept donations, which makes a huge difference. Right now we're doing a gift drive for kids who have a parent who's missing or murdered. You can go on our Amazon wish list and pick out the toy you want to buy direct. The kid picked that toy out for themselves. So that's always fun. We always need help in that area. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of ways to get involved in this movement. Spreading awareness, supporting leaders that are taking a positive stance on the issue, creating platforms for families and survivors to share, donate to other organizations that are doing the work, whether that's a domestic violence shelter or another Indigenous-led anti-violence org. And then uplift tribal sovereignty and find your entry point to take action. And I want to highlight, we have free for download on our website, an organizing toolkit around this issue. And it's meant to be interactive. It's got like worksheets, activity guides, quizzes. There's an entry point for everybody, whether it's, media, policy, boots on the ground work, public awareness, community healing projects. Everybody has a place in this, whether you're Native or not, whether you're affected or not. And the idea behind the organizing toolkit is to help you figure out what that entry point is for you in terms of, what skills you have, what time investment you have, and where your passions are and where you're pulled to. So please do check that out. This is how you can contact us and reach out to us for more information. And thank you so much for listening today. Yeah, Ish.
Keep that up for a second, Anita. So I'd like to post exactly where, what's your handle on Instagram?
Our Instagram is Sovereign Bodies.
Okay. So they can just look that up. And what else did you say? Can you go back to that last slide? Just want to make sure.
Or this one?
Yeah, the last one. Just want to make sure that people don't have to search far for helping. So you said spread awareness, support community leaders, create. Okay. And then, go back to the next slide. And then this is where you can donate directly. So just going to your website, we can find a donation link.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we accept online donations and also via check. If there's a chat function, I can put the direct donation link in.
There is. Do you see it on the right? It'll say.
Yes.
Okay.
The really cool thing about our financial system is when you donate, like it also shows you how we spend our money. So you can see exactly where your dollars are going. It'll say like Walmart purchase. It doesn't say who it's going to, but that at Walmart we're either buying clothes or food for somebody. we like having that level of transparency.
This is amazing. You've done, so how long has this been going on?
We late 2018.
You've done so much in what, 4 years?
We have a small but mighty team. Right now we have, we have eight people on our team, including three interns. So there's 5 of us that are more permanent staff. We do a lot with a little, but it's because, it's personal to all of us. And hopefully that's a testament to, like, supporting people that are directly impacted by the issue at hand, whether it's, this issue and families or survivors, but I think that value can also be applied in other situations too. We're motivated, we're dedicated, and we know what to do, and we're anxious to get it done. We just need the resources and the support to do it.
And I also want to say that I've downloaded that toolkit. And if you're listening, I just want you to know that toolkit is amazing. It really is, I'm into community organizing and really helping communities mobilize around issues. And honestly, you all wrote the book on it. And I feel like we're all, the other marginalized communities, I don't know. I feel like we've been trying to reinvent the wheel, but even some of the language that's used, it really helped me see my work in a very different way after reading that and understanding, the true sense of colonization, and how impactful it's been in a really negative way, and really looking at one line that I took from that, was the paradigm of taking. That the paradigm of natives are sharing and community and, making sure that resources are there for everyone. And so to really be disrupted by a culture of taking and ownership, I just can't, I now imagine how much more foreign that was, for people who had to, even try to welcome them. I was like, well, now that you're here, here's how you grow corn, and here's how, it was like, you come in here like it's crazy, but we're still willing to share, and teach and help you, understand how this land works. And then it's just, a lot of taken advantage of. And so, just thank you, you, and just on behalf of all that your community does and has and will continue to do on behalf of equity, and justice. And I don't know, this is a lot of learning for me, and I want to continue to learn and continue to advocate, on behalf, of Native Americans. And so, is there any, last minute words you'd like to leave us with?
Sure. I just want to say that, yeah, this is an everybody issue. It's a Native issue, but it's also an everybody issue. We all benefit from increased public safety. We all benefit from a responsive justice system that values human life. Like I said, there really is an entry point for everybody. The story that I love to leave people with, because I feel like this can also be very overwhelming of like, there's so much to do and there's so much bad stuff happening, is there was a white lady here in Montana, a young mom with 2 kids, and she never knew anything about this issue until, like, I don't know, I think she saw a podcast like this, because she was into like crime podcasts, and she reached out to us and wanted to know how to get involved. And I, just kind of told her like, well, awareness is always good, try to do something like that. And she was the most persistent. I'm still blown away. She called every major news publication in the state of Montana every time a new case happened, and would call them repeatedly and say, why aren't you covering this case? Why aren't you covering this case? to the point where one of the newspapers actually told her, like, lady, you're harassing us. You need to stop calling. And her response was like, look, I'm a stay-at-home mom. I can watch Frozen 5 times today, or I can keep calling you. And it worked. The state's biggest newspaper issued a public apology for their lack of coverage of the issue and created dedicated coverage that has continued for the last 2 years since she started doing that. So there really is an entry point for everyone. And sometimes it's just being persistent and, doing what you're able to do and what you're called to do. So if anybody's feeling, passionate about this issue, sometimes it's just making phone calls, but it does make a huge difference.
Thank you so much for telling that story, because that is true allyship. Like, that is a person who is an ally. And we all know that if it had been a Native person calling 15 times, they would have continued to ignore it. So kudos to her, and kudos to all of you who choose to be allies on so many issues that you really can get involved in. And hopefully, if this particular podcast has motivated you to be an ally, I encourage you to do that. And let us know. And Annita, I really do want to stay connected to you. If you have anything that you'd like to broadcast, please call on us. I would love to assist you in, posting something, whatever you need. Just let me know, and I will continue to find ways that I can be helpful with the community. Because, as you said, doing it for anybody helps everybody. So I really appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for your time and attention and the work that you're doing. And I look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Everybody have a great day.